Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's presentation, Arctic to Africa, Wildlife Photography with Anthony Amsel, is brought to you by NatHab Expedition Leader Charlie Reinertsen and, of course, Anthony Amsel. Anthony is a wildlife biology specialist from Montreal who has built a career in conservation research and wildlife management. He's a member of the prestigious Canadian Conservation Photographers Collective, and his work has been featured in Canadian Geographic. As a seasoned expedition leader specializing in Arctic ecology and marine wildlife, Anthony has guided expeditions across diverse northern landscapes, from Greenland's icy fjords to Hudson Bay's coastal tundra, combining his scientific expertise with exceptional nature photography skills. Charlie is the founder of Two Line Studio, and he holds dual master's degree in natural science education and environment and natural resources from the University of Wyoming. More than a decade in conservation and science communication, he's a photographer, videographer, writer, exhibit developer, and commercially licensed drone pilot who created the Northern Peatland Project, a photographic journey through one of Earth's rarest ecosystems. As an expedition leader, Charlie guides wildlife photography and ecology expeditions from Yellowstone to Mexico's monarch butterfly biosphere reserve, bringing his diverse expertise in visual storytelling and natural sciences to each trip. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today. Take it away, Charlie.
Let's see if we live up to those bios, Anthony.
We'll do our best.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Rob, and welcome everyone to this chat this afternoon. Really excited to dive into a portfolio of photographs from Anthony's work from Arctic to Africa. We're going to be talking about the ecology behind these photographs. We'll be talking about how you might be able to get photographs like this or see these sites on a NatHab trip. And we're also going to dive into some technical aspects of photography if you are a photographer who's working to improve or learn a bit more about the craft. So we'll just dive right in here. And before we take a look at your photos, Anthony, I'd love for you just to start by telling us a little bit about how you got into photography and what draws you to trying to capture the world around you.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, Charlie, Rob, thanks for having me today. This is unlike most webinars that we get to do. So this is a gift. It really, really is. Photography, I mean, it's probably always been a part of my life on a certain level without realizing it. Of course, with today's modern era of smartphones, it's literally at your fingertips. But I think when I was younger, I remember my mom got me my first point and shoot, and just nonstop. I was going all over the place with it. I just, had so much fun just taking pictures. And of course, even before that was the good old kind of throwaway cameras, which thankfully don't exist that much anymore from a sustainability point of view. But it was all about click, 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 click. And then I started traveling, and it was such a good way to just bring home memories. My grandmother passed away a few years ago, and she was a world traveler. She was the one who inspired me really to get around the world. And she'd always come home and bring a little trinket or a little something. And it was our way to connect, whether it was a seashell, whether it was a rock or something like that. And what I realized is my trinket is imagery. It's pictures that I get to bring home. And that has evolved over time from being a way to bring home memories from trips to connecting people with nature, especially in the line of work that we get to do. We're very privileged to be able to go to these unbelievably remote areas and to call ourselves very much adventurers. And as a guide, you want to connect people with nature. At least that's why I do the guiding work that I do. But I recognize that not everybody has the opportunity to go to these amazing places. So by taking pictures of whether it's landscape, whether it's wildlife, connecting people and really garnering that interest, but more importantly, the idea of protecting these areas is the tool that I want photography to be. So it's become this evolution from, a little kid just enjoying taking pictures and memories to now becoming very much a significant tool in the arsenal for conservation and storytelling. So that's, I guess, the gist of it.
I love that, and that's really great. Yeah, I see a lot of parallels there with how I got into photography, and it's such a natural way for to be able to share your experience in these places with other people. And so there's the photography aspect of why you're excited about that, and I'm sure it'll be kind of similar. But how did you get into guiding, and why is that? Something that's really important to you to kind of pair with the interest in photography.
Yeah, the parallels are very, very similar. Actually, yeah, this picture is awesome. It was taken about 10 days ago on our Greenland trip that we do by my co-guide, Alex. And I think this picture kind of summarizes why I became a guide. To the untrained eye, it might not seem like much, might seem like I just have a couple of rocks in my hands. But those are actually very old, decayed whale vertebrae with moss growing inside. So you have these, very old specimens from a whale that was probably harvested, by indigenous people a very long time ago. And you have this beautiful little micro ecosystem growing inside. And as a guide, the whole world around us is fascinating, whether it's megafauna like polar bears or this tiny little moss growing inside the whale vertebrae. And again, being able to connect people with that and kind of, poking behind the curtain of your everyday kind of superficial nature and having people dive into it on a much more profound level is what for me guiding is all about. And in this picture you can see I also have my camera strapped around me because there's always an opportunity. So to be able to really mix the worlds of conservation, of storytelling, but also just the childhood glee of just being amazed by the world around us, it's such a beautiful moment for me as a guide when I see someone on my trip have an oh my gosh moment, where they're in the field, they didn't realize how closely linked they were to some of the things that we're seeing in a place as remote as Greenland or Hudson Bay or on the west coast, of Canada. So it's being able to pair all of these things together, taking my wildlife biology and really pushing it to the level where you can become a storyteller and really have people just appreciate nature on a different level.
That's very neat. And I love this picture too because you give a guide a couple bones that you find in the environment, and there are a few hours of material that you could pull from.
Yeah, you even have to bite your tongue sometimes because you're like, if I say everything now, I won't have material for a week from now.
Yeah, exactly. And I love how, getting a wider view of this same photo, you're seeing, it's not just you excited about these bones.
Yeah, yeah, that was one of our guests, James. He was awesome. You talk about childhood glee, and when you see guests kind of forget the hustle and bustle back home and just be in that moment, it's a gift.
Absolutely. So this is just kind of an overview of where we're headed in our chat today. And I'd really encourage everyone as you're listening to think of questions, whether it's a technical question about a particular photograph, or if you learn something about a species that you want to know more about, or a trip that you want to know more about. Feel free to put those into the chat, and then Rob will help us go through those at the very end of the webinar today. So anything you come up with, you can put in there. And just love to dive in. One of these first, before we go to the photos themselves, just wanted to chat a little bit about the gear that you use. And this is your camera box. And while you're kind of talking about these aspects, what was that moment you started with the point and shoot and disposable cameras? What was that moment where suddenly you realized, oh, this is shifting from just something I like into something that I'm going to perfect and kind of create as part of my occupation?
Yeah, that's a really good question because sometimes I ask myself the same thing, and I don't think there was a specific moment. I think it was a slow transition where going from a point and shoot, you realize the quality of your images sometimes aren't really up to par with what you want. That wildlife is really far away. And of course, you never want to disturb wildlife when you're taking pictures of them, whether you're in a situation where they're up close or they're far away. So, kind of clawing at technology and trying to expand my gearbox, because I am very much a gear junkie, like most photographers are. It kind of comes with the territory, right? So I'd say probably guiding is what was one of those pivotal moments, that stepping stone in this evolution of photography for me. Again, we're privileged to be able to go to these amazing places, and I realized that the messages I wanted to send home with guests were more than just verbal; they were also visual. NatHab does such an amazing job at having a photo share album on its adventure portal, and to be able to have guests go home with those visual memories and think about them, but also impact their daily lives, becomes such an important fundamental piece of what I do as a guide. So having the tools to be able to do that is something that became absolutely fundamental, which led to this beautiful gearbox that I have today. And I do have to say, for the techies out there, sometimes you don't need to go spend tons and tons of money, because photography gear is expensive. A lot of what I get is secondhand. Sometimes if I don't have a choice, or I'm constrained for time, I'll buy new. But a lot of what I have is secondhand, and it allows me to have a bit more flexibility with my budget as well, because photography gear can be a little pricey from time to time. But yeah, I'd say that transition was slow, and today I'm very happy with the tools that I have in front of me.
Absolutely. And before we move on from this, is there what have you looked to for learning more about photography? Like, are there certain photographers that you follow, or did you ever take classes in photography? What's that process been like for you?
Yeah, I remember taking a class in photography back in college. It was one of my extracurriculars, and it was so much fun. And it was one of those stepping stones, like I mentioned. But beyond that, today there's so many talented photographers out there. I mean, some of our colleagues, the photo expedition leaders, are unbelievable, and being able to sit down with them and pick their brain and kind of nerding out about photography really, really helps. Even some of our guests sometimes who come on to our trips, we learn from each other, and I think that that's such a beautiful thing. Otherwise, when I'm home, I gotta say YouTube is one of my favorite sources of information. I can spend hours looking at tutorials about how to use a certain lens, a certain camera, how to get a certain filter, or how to play around in Lightroom with some post processing. So I think what's great today is there are so many different sources that you can play around with. But it can become super overwhelming. When I first started, I didn't know which direction I wanted to go into. And I think that as a photographer, you're constantly evolving. So I think it becomes really important to not get too overwhelmed with things, to start off small, pick little objectives, go towards that. And over time, it'll start adding up. And over time, you'll really become a well rounded photographer. And don't get me wrong, I have some beautiful images, but there's still so much I'm learning. And I don't think I ever want to stop learning, because it's such a fun hobby and it's such a fun thing to do.
Absolutely. I love that. All right, so let's dive in. This first image that you shared with me, it's of an incredibly iconic
Hmm.
animal, and one that is near and dear to you. But before we get there, I keep teasing the image. I just wanted to show these are the places where you guide, and kind of focused on the northern climates. And so for anyone who's interested in going on a trip with Anthony, these are the places where you might be able to run into him. And we'll kind of mention these places as we go through the various different photos. Anything you want to mention here before we go on?
People are afraid of the cold, but it's worth the challenge. You got to work for it, but the bounty is very fruitful afterwards. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. And your images definitely speak to that. So here's our first shot from the presentation, and just like from my perspective, you're looking at just this gorgeous straight. This is when people go on the polar bear expedition, this is what they're hoping to come home with if they're in a photography state of mind. And a couple things that I'll point out before I pass it over to you about why you're excited about this image. The focus is just
Mhm.
pinpoint, crisp on the eyes. I love the texture on the nose. It just feels really expressive. It feels like I'm able to have like a moment with this bear where I feel like the bear is looking at me, and not in an aggressive way, kind of in a curious, open way. The other thing I'll point out too that I see in this photo that I really love that you did is that people have a tendency sometimes to over edit, photos, and this just feels like I'm out there in the wilderness with this bear. It feels like the tones that you would see in the tundra. There's so much flexibility that we have now in both the
Mhm.
technology and the depth of how much you can recover from shadows or bring down from highlights, that I think editing has become kind of its own art form. Um, and so just wanted to kind of start from that place from a photography perspective, that I love how you've edited this to feel really natural. But I'd love to hear from you, like what draws you. You tell me a little bit about this moment, like what's
Yeah,
been
yeah.
leading up to getting this shot.
Thanks for that compliment. I mean, honestly, we could probably spend an hour talking about this shot because there's so much that speaks through the image as you conveyed. You know, Churchill's a special place. There's a reason why it's one of Nat Hab's premier tours, is because when you're able to lock eyes with a polar bear like this, you feel it. My very first expedition that I ever did with Nat Hab was with polar bears. And I remember the first time that we saw a polar bear with guests, of course. Um, there was this woman, and she was on the back of the rover, and we're just looking at bears, and she locked eyes with this polar bear, and she started crying. Her lifelong goal was to see polar bears. There's something emotional about them, and I'd say this is the case for bears in general. People can argue either way, but bears are incredibly inquisitive. There's something you mentioned there where you said there's a curiosity, and I think that is so accurate for these amazing creatures. This picture was taken towards the end of the season. That's why in the back there's not that much color. It's a lot more snow, and as you said, post processing is an artwork, and you can spend so much time. You can oversaturate, over highlight, over this, over that, even over vignetting is a thing that I was very much guilty of in my first early days, because it's just so easy and it looks kind of cool. But getting those tones is so important. And on this particular day, the ceiling, the cloud ceiling was so low, and it was so kind of dark, and there was something tense in the air. And at the end of the season, which of course is towards mid of November, the bears are congregating in pretty strong numbers along the coast, because that's why they're there. They're waiting for the sea ice to form, and that's why we're very privileged to be able to go see them along the shorelines where they're accumulating in great numbers. And there was a lot of energy in the air. And then all of a sudden, we weren't even focusing on this particular bear. We were actually focusing on a group that was probably about, I'd say, 50 to 60 feet away from us, two or three bears. And then from the corner of my eye, and this is where, being situationally aware as a photographer is so important. This bear just popped its head right over this willow bush. That's the foliage that you see in the front. And there was something so pure about this bear just poking its head up and just kind of looking at us, and for a moment you feel like you're the one being observed, not that you're observing the polar bear. And thankfully I had my telephoto, because this bear was pretty far away. So I had my 200 to 600 on, and I just kind of snapped a picture of it. I didn't even think about it that much, to be honest with you, because I was so focused on the two or three bears that were trying to nap, not too far away from us. And then when I went back and I started looking through my pictures, I was ready to actually throw this image in the trash at first, because, obviously it's a little bit cropped because it was so far away. But it goes to show that sometimes even the pictures that you don't think are maybe the best can be crisp. They can be emotional if you take the time to really look into them. So I'm super happy this bear poked its head up, because it was such a beautiful moment. And especially polar bears, as guides we like to say that there's multiple personalities, and I think that holds true. You do have bears that are very skittish. They don't want anything to do with us. And when we see a bear like that, we don't go after it, because of course we never want to put pressure on the animal. Some bears are indifferent, probably like the two or three bears that we were hanging out with. They're just kind of doing their thing, not really paying attention to us. And then there's bears like this, that they pop their head up and they kind of look at you, as you're looking back, and they want to know what's going on in their environment. And that's what I love about this image, is being able to convey that really, almost face to face encounter. And it is a beautiful moment. It's unbelievable when you get that. So this is definitely one of my favorite images. And like you said, Charlie, it's kind of the image that everybody wants to get, in the sense that they want a beautiful crop picture of the face of a polar bear. Unless you have any other questions, I'm also going to tease the next one because this relates a little bit to the next one in terms of how to frame your animal.
Yeah, before we go on to that, I just have a couple technical questions for
For
you.
sure.
Your cloud cover, it's dark. You don't have a lot of light on the scene. You happen to have your telephoto, which is great. So you're 200 to 600. Um, Two things I see are challenging here: having a shutter speed where things are crisp, um, and then also you've got that willow bush. Um, if you were using autofocus, it might be pretty hard to get tack sharp on the eyes. So tell me a little bit more about the technical side, like how you were
Yeah.
able to get this really fleeting moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Focus is every wildlife photographer's kind of, double-edged sword because when you get it right, you can get crispness like no other. But of course, you need to be able to set it up properly. When you're dealing with animals that are around foliage, the way that I like to do it is I have as small of a focus zone as possible. So in this case, I did have my autofocus on, but my autofocus zone was as small as it can get, and you can toggle around with it a little bit because you want to be able to focus on what's behind the willow bush. So
Yeah,
that's the first thing. The second thing, of course, lighting. Lighting becomes an issue, especially in those darker days towards the end of November when the snowstorms are starting to come in. So your ISO is bumped up pretty hard. I am someone who does do a lot of post processing, of course, trying to keep it as natural as possible. What I love about post processing nowadays is you can compensate for your ISO. So I actually bump my ISO quite high. I think people are still a little kind of, fearful of playing around with that because they're afraid of the white noise that it produces. But you can compensate with a lot of other things. So I probably had an ISO easily up around 5 or 6,000, if not more, for this
yeah,
one.
yeah,
And like you said, your shutter speed though is a huge thing. So you're not, these aren't birds. They're not fluttering really fast in front of you. They are giant animals and they can move quite quickly, but you can also kind of lower your shutter speed a little bit. And of course, then, I mean, your aperture setting is super important. And I wanted to be able to get a little bit of the foliage in there because I think it's so important to to speak to the animal's environment. So it was a little bit of a challenge, but once what I love about Churchill is generally speaking, when you get days like that, your lighting is probably going to stay about similar throughout the day. So those initial settings that you can get, either you can just customize them and just throw them in there at the beginning of the day. That way, if you kind of just change for a split second, for a bird, for example, that comes and flies by, you can go back to your customized settings. But in moments like that, it's the way I like to do things. I look at my lighting for the day, see what's going to happen. Of course, if you have overcast and then pockets of sunshine, it can be a little bit challenging. But in this particular scenario, I just went with my initial settings from the morning and just stayed with those, and of course played a little bit with my shutter speed. So that's kind of the technical part behind that.
awesome. And you were about to tease the next photo.
Mm.
Uh, Go ahead. Did you have something you wanted to add before we
No,
got?
well, I was just going to say as a transition point, again, a lot of people want that kind of crisp, perfectly framed headshot of a polar bear. Getting the foliage in this is kind of a nice little treat because it attests to the animal's environment in its immediate vicinity. But the next image I think is also one of my favorites because instead of just framing the bear's face, you're really framing the whole animal in the immensity of its terrain. So let's hop on over to that one. Yeah, beautiful polar bear, very much on the edge of Hudson Bay. People think about the tundra in so many different ways, and to me, this is also very much part of the tundra. It's flat for the most part, but you also get these amazing rocky outcrops here, especially with the orange. That's called elegant sunburst. It's a type of lichen that you'll find all over that tundra in that ecosystem. And what I love about this is the fact that we just talked about how bears are waiting on the shoreline for the sea ice to form. And as you can see in the back, there is no sea ice there, right? And I think you can play a little bit into the climate change aspect of this without going down that rabbit hole too much because we'll be here till next week. But I think that sometimes as wildlife photographers, we forget to frame the animal in its landscape. And I mean, these rocks aren't huge, and polar bears are a massive animal. But I think in this frame, there's something almost kind of sweet about this animal. It looks a little bit smaller. It looks a little bit more vulnerable in this big landscape that it's in. Very kind of dramatic scene. Again, the lighting was very, very similar. This was also with the telephoto because when we're in Churchill, we take specific trails. We don't just go off road because we don't want to damage the environment. We stick to a subset of trails. So that does limit your capabilities a little bit. But again, you also don't want to go pressure this bear. This bear is between the water and between us, and you don't want to necessarily have to push it into the aquatic environment. Of course, they are marine mammals. Polar bears are marine mammals. But you, at this time of the year especially, they've been fasting for a number of months. They're probably low energy. They have low calorie output. So making sure that you kind of appreciate all of those elements and throwing that into a picture is sometimes easier said than done. But it's what I love about this one is you get those popping elements from the tundra and from the rocky outcrops. You get the water in the back. This polar bear is right in its element, right where it's supposed to be.
Yeah, this is a really, really neat one. I feel like it's one that, as you look at it longer, you start to notice more about it. I like how the lines of the rock kind of invite you to kind of look through the whole image. You're not, initially you're just looking at the bear. And at first the bear seems really small. And then when you look at its feet, you realize just how big that bear
Yeah.
is. I feel like having that front paw in focus there does a lot for like, wow, that's a gigantic bear.
They're
Um,
big animals.
yeah, and I mean that story is like so obvious from the very beginning of just looking at the ocean and not seeing any ice whatsoever. Yeah, this one kind of stood out to me as
Mm,
being um, quite the storytelling piece. Like the first one being like, oh, I got that close up, beautiful shot, portrait of a polar bear, and then this one feels like, well, this is the story behind
that's
the
it. That's it.
conditions. Yeah, really beautiful. And again, I mean, back to kind of thinking about editing, and a couple things here. I mean, I think you have just enough depth of field to get enough information in the ocean to tell you that it's ocean. Because otherwise, if
Mhm.
that was more out of focus, you'd kind of lose that. Um, but there's not so much depth of field that you're not sure where to look. Like it just has just enough. It's putting your eye right on the bear. And when you have a polar bear, I would imagine, I have never photographed polar bears, but I would
Not yet.
imagine you're right. Yeah. It's kind of tricky because you're photographing an all white animal with, like, especially some of the areas you're trying to focus on are these really dark pits in their face. And then trying to get the exposure right so that their fur looks good against the landscape and so that they're not overblown in the highlights, but that and I think that in this situation, the clouds are kind of helping you out here because otherwise your highlights would get pretty blown out. Do you have any tips for people that
Yeah.
when you do get sunlight, and which maybe is rare, but sunlight and polar bears, what has worked for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the most crucial things I'd say about photographing polar bears. I love overcast days because those clouds just create perfect, natural, diffused lighting. You don't need to worry about overexposing. You don't need to worry about getting those images blown out. But we do get sun. We do get sunlight in Churchill. I do promise you. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen around that time. Summertime, beautiful, beautiful sunny area. When we do see polar bears in the light, though, their fur is actually quite transparent. So it not only reflects but refracts the light. It can become really tricky, but it's a double-edged sword because you can get some amazing, amazing pictures with the right lighting. I'd say that again, they're not fast animals on a general basis. So what I like to tell people who are in my rover is, play around with your settings. I usually underexpose as much as I can. I go full manual for everything. And depending on your camera, of course, depending on settings, sometimes depending on what you're doing, you might not have that option. But what I like to do is underexpose a little bit. And again, in post processing, I can bring out those highlights if I need to, because as soon as that bear just turns its face a little bit, it'll refract enough light that it completely gets washed out. So I
Hmm.
usually tell people underexpose a little bit, or maybe increase your shutter speed, do something to kind of bring the highlights down. And so far we haven't even seen images of polar bears in snow, and we see a little bit of snow here, but then that's the other issue because on a sunny day with snow and ice on the ground plus a polar bear, it basically just becomes a battle of glare. It's glare everywhere. I mean, there's no getting around the fact that, middle of the day, you're getting very harsh lights. So, depends on what you want to do. But I usually tell people that it's a great time to play around and practice. Again, underexpose, increase your shutter speed, bring your ISO down as much as you can. And if you end up with a darker image, that's okay too. Again, I think that play with light with polar bears is so fun to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't remember. Is the next one staying in this habitat? 'Cause I have one more question about that before we go on. I
It's
think
yeah,
it
it's
is.
not. So by all means, go right
Okay.
ahead, ask your question.
Yeah, so for folks who aren't familiar, if you're on a trip with NatHab and you're up in Churchill, you mentioned the rover. Can you kind of describe what's it like to photograph from that? What is that machine like, and what's the experience for the guests?
Absolutely. I'd say a rover is probably it's probably as if a train car and a monster truck had a baby of some sort. So you're talking about a machine that's about 50 feet long, give or take. Your feet are minimally 9 feet off the floor. So you're always kind of looking down a little bit, um, which again has its pros and its cons. But what I love about our rovers and what I love about the NatHab trips is every single person has a window seat, and those windows go down like they do in old school buses. So we have little latches. Sometimes they get frozen. We're also, as guides, certified window technicians, so we can always
Yeah.
help people out with that. But then there's this back deck on the back of the rover. So you open up this door and you go, and you have 270 degrees of visibility. Your field of vision is pretty vast. So you have that option to do it from inside or outside in terms of photography. Heat haze can be a thing, and it's something that we do talk about with photographers who are on their trips when you're kind of just pushing your camera outside of the windows. Generally speaking, we have ways to kind of mitigate that. But being on that back deck is so nice because you have the option to have a sweeping view. Of course, the back deck, polar bears can't get in. Again, it's at least 9 feet off the ground, depending on where we are on the road. And it's conceived that way so that you don't get a close up encounter with the polar bears. You want to keep your distance, being apex predators. But it's a really neat experience. You're not zooming on the tundra. You're going maybe 5 to 10 miles an hour at most because again, you don't want to miss anything. The roads are also very rugged and very bumpy for anyone who's been up there, very well. But going at those slow speeds is also nice because you don't miss anything. You have that opportunity, and even when you're in the rover, everything is windowed. So the rover drivers, the guides, are always on the lookout for wildlife. And of course, every single guest in the rover is doing the same thing. So different angles that you can get around with. You can play with so many different types of angles. Of course, if we're fortunate enough to have a bear come very close to the rover, sometimes your telephoto becomes completely useless because that bear is almost right up in your face.
What a great problem to
I
have.
know, right? Oh, woe is us. Woe is us. Which is why personally I do have two camera bodies. I always love to have my telephoto on one camera body and then I have a wide angle on the other. And sometimes even the wide angle, there are people around you, so sometimes cell phones become the best thing you can do. So I always have my cell phone ready to go. I always have my wide angle and my telephoto.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, it's time to head to a new habitat. Where are we here?
We are in Iceland. Iceland. So Arctic foxes, and I do know why you asked that question because you can find them in Churchill, of course. We do see them from time to time, but in this particular instance, this is what a summer in Iceland looks like. So I actually took this picture at the beginning of this season. A beautiful, beautiful fox kit that is slowly learning how to hunt. We think about play as this childish thing when it comes to human beings, but play is so important. And learning animal behavior is so incredibly important when you're a wildlife photographer. It's why I love having a background in wildlife biology because it allows me to kind of get more into the minds of these animals, right? So in this particular instance, we're in this beautiful, beautiful meadow in the highlands, and we're watching these fox kits play. And this particular kit just had this look in its eye, and it's really what I wanted to capture, the look of trying to forage, trying to sneak up on its prey. The funny thing is, fox kits, they're really clumsy when they start playing. They need to tune in those skills, which is why that play is so important. In this particular instance, I thought that the fox kit had honed in on maybe a rabbit or something like that. Turns out it was just a clump of dirt. Just going after some roots. But it was so fun to see, this animal that was only, a couple of months old, barely even just learn to tune in and hone in on its hunting skills. You can see the ears are very forward, the gaze is very precise, and Arctic foxes have this amazing organ. It's called the auditory bulla. It's at the back of the skull. It's basically their inner ear cavity. So they have essentially telescopic hearing. I love how I'm doing these hand movements. It's the same thing I would do as a guide, right? So they can move their ears, and you've probably seen dogs and cats do this. But what Arctic fox can do is really pinpoint high frequency sounds like the scratching of an animal in the dirt. And you can see it in this picture. You can see how it's ready. Its tail isn't up, it's not ready to pounce. It's just a little bit tucked in. It's a little bit lower in the grass, really almost blended with its surroundings. And during the summertime, you can see its coat is a lot lighter. In the winter, it'll completely change. It'll be pure, pure white, unless you get a different morph, but that's a whole other conversation. So you have this amazing animal, one of the most probably prestigious scavengers on the planet. They also do follow polar bears. They'll go after polar bear carcasses after the polar bears have walked off. They can survive incredible temperatures, and they need to learn how to be able to do that. And in this particular picture, I had a midfield lens, so I had my 70 to 200, which I absolutely loved. Super, super, super crisp. Got very low to the ground because, of course, you start thinking about angles. I wanted to be at that fox's level. I wanted to see what it was seeing. Of course, there's a little bit of grass in front of it, but I think that just speaks to the type of environment it's in. So 200 to 700, it was actually low light as well. I don't know why that keeps being a recurring theme so far. But on the left-hand side of the picture, you can see there is a little bit of light there where you're getting the last rays that were coming before the sun dipped underneath the horizon. So very much dusk because they are crepuscular animals. And it was just so nice to just really be at that level and try to see what it was seeing until I realized again, it was that clump of dirt.
Yeah, I think that's part of what makes this image so successful is having that little bit of warm light coming in from the left there, and it seems like you know once again because you're down in the grass with the fox, you're up against kind of that bane of a lot of photographers' existence, having some grass in the foreground that could play with your autofocus. So are you using the pinpoint again and kind of using the thumb pad to move that around to get
That's
focus
exactly
on
it. That's
it?
exactly it. Anytime there's foliage, I mean, every photographer has their trick. That's mine, is pinpoint focus, having my thumb on the toggle so I can constantly move. Of course, eye tracking is a thing which works really well until you get into a point where there's a lot of foliage. So I just love having that manual control because I can adjust it in real time.
That's awesome. And for a photo like this, sometimes you get things that are in focus that are distracting. That doesn't feel that way that with this photo, but do you ever bring in like a filter that softens the focus in certain areas to bring the focus in for post editing, or are you pretty true to the what the focus grabs on the photo itself?
I'm pretty true. I really like to set up my shot in a way that once I've taken it, I just need to do minimal post processing.
Yeah,
As you mentioned earlier, it's so easy to kind of just become inundated with all the possibilities. And in general, I think that is a trap that a lot of photographers fall into, especially with mirrorless cameras nowadays. It's so easy to just hit your shutter and take 40, 50, 100 shots. I like to think back to my point and shoot days, or even my little Kodak days, where you have limited amount of shots because it forces you to think about the shot you want to get, wait for that perfect moment, and then take it. And I find that then when you look at your image, it becomes so much more gratifying. You really work to get this image instead of just kind of having a barrage of clicks.
yeah, and I find that if I have a sense of dread when I'm downloading my photos, it means that I wasn't as diligent in the field as I wanted to be.
Yep. When you can see the little wheel of death just loading all your images, you're like,
Yeah.
okay, maybe I took too many.
Well, and the ironic thing I always find, I don't know if you find this, that I'll take a couple pictures in the beginning and then I'll keep trying to refine, refine, refine. The vast majority of the time, the first or second shot, unless there was some really crazy thing with settings, usually those are my favorite, and so it's like, why
That's
are we
it.
taking thousands of pictures for the first one?
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. Well said.
All right, another shot here. A couple things I'll point out before I pass it back over to you. I mean, just this moment in time, looking at the fur, just ecologically speaking, and thinking about that transition. I love how you
Mhm.
captured that. Once again, the light, it feels very overcast, even lighting, and then getting the flowers in the foreground just to have some texture, and they almost like feel like lights in the foreground. Those are, some of the things that draw me to this. But tell me a bit more. What are we looking at here? And
Absolutely. We're looking at the beautiful woodland caribou. This time we're kind of jumping between Canada and, the North Atlantic. So we're back in Newfoundland, Canada here on the very, very eastern fronts of the country. And again, that low light is something I just strive for because I just think it's so beautiful. Um, we talked about animal behavior, right? Caribou and a lot of mammals are very site fidelic, which means they go back to the same places. Whether it's, week after week or day after day or hour after hour. In this particular frame, this little tiny population of caribou have very habitual trends where they go back to the same place every day. So it was about going to that place and just being patient, after everyone had gone. I won't disclose where it is because I am very sensitive about location. And of course, we don't want to stress animals out. I will say it's Newfoundland. And if you do a little bit of digging, you can find out where this is. But they tend to go back to their same little bedding area every single evening. And again, that animal behavior becomes so important. And this was a really special encounter. So this was probably one of the very big bull males that was in the area. You mentioned the fur. So this is right around that cusp of summertime. So we're talking about late spring. So they're molting, they're losing their winter fur. And you can see the velvet on the antlers is really, really fresh here. It was special because these caribou have been habituated to humans. And there's a whole debate between habituation and conditioning. They're not being baited. There's no food. They're just indifferent to humans, of course, while you respect their space. And in this event, it was me and one other person, and we're in this beautiful meadow with these flowers that are just bloomed. Everything felt fresh. Everything felt just new. And this little tiny herd, actually let us get really, really close. We stuck to the trail, of course. We didn't want to go off the trail, but there was a moment where this animal was about 30 feet from where I was, and I was standing on the ground again at eye level with it. And that comes from being patient, from being quiet, from also reading animal behavior and respecting the environment they're in. So this was special. Again, you have that sunlight kind of just setting, on the horizon, and this beautiful kind of subarctic vibe going. The tree is a little bit out of focus here, but you would have had a spruce tree in the back. You have these beautiful subarctic flowers that are popping up, a few buttercups here and there. So I really wanted to capture that vibe of the kind of renaissance of spring into summer, and so much change happening between the flowers blooming, the fur molting off, and then this just beautiful, beautiful animal in the center of it all.
absolutely, yeah, it's a great shot. That's a really cool story behind it too. Changing ecosystems yet again.
Uh,
What are we looking at
Whales, whales,
here?
whales. Whales are probably one of my spirit animals. I feel like I have a cornucopia of them. We could talk about whales forever. This particular shot was my first trip in Iceland. The waters were just so calm, and in the back you'll see the background's very, very blurred out. Not because I intended that, but because there was a fog front that came in. It kind of created this very mystical kind of moment. It's really nice to get, those images of whales breaching. Everyone kind of wants to get that. They're few and far between. You have to be very lucky. But I think that sometimes just focusing on the fluke of a whale, fluke being the tail of the whale, and just seeing it for what it is so majestic. This was so, so nice to get this perfectly crisp shot of its tail. And you can see the markings, and every single fluke is unique to that individual. It's like a fingerprint. So getting that is just so crisp, and it was so quiet. That animal was probably about 50 feet from where we were diving. And again, I had my midfield lens on, my 70-200, just with all the same settings I would get in an overcast day. I'm really, really realizing I like overcast days. They make photography easy. But more importantly, the reason I wanted to include this was because on the bottom, you'll see that there's a little square that says Happy Whale in there. So this is my image, but Happy Whale is an organization, and this is my kind of little side note for people to use their photography for citizen science. What you can do with Happy Whale is when you take a picture of a whale, whether it's its fluke or something that has very specific markings, you can upload it to Happy Whale. You just go to happywhale.com. And what they'll do is they'll either identify it as an individual that's already in the database, and every time that someone else identifies it, they'll actually send you an email saying, hey, we spotted your whale, and that can be across the world. or there'll be a new individual. And to date, they have over 100,000 individuals. They have over 1 million different entries. It's such a beautiful, beautiful program, because beyond just identifying where these animals are, that data is then used by researchers, by governments, by NGOs to then designate beautiful migratory areas and add protection to these animals, and really see where they're migrating to, where are they congregating. So it's an amazing tool to use as a citizen who might not have a degree in science, to just snap a picture. And it doesn't need to be the most crisp. As long as you can see identifying features, you can just upload it to Happy Whale. So I'll stop it there, because I could keep talking and going on that tangent, but a beautiful way to kind of just give back to science with simple photography.
That's really, really cool. I love that. And here we're into this is our first sunshine shot. We'll say that. Maybe
Yes.
it was more overcast, but definitely different settings here. So tell me about this interaction.
Yeah, so this was actually on the same trip just a couple of days later, where we actually got sunshine in Iceland, because it does happen out in the West Fjords. So this is a white-beaked dolphin, very much a resident of the North Atlantic. The reason I love this shot is for a couple of reasons. I mean, it's just cool. Again, you've got this dolphin just completely coming out of the water, doing some aerial acrobatics. From a technical standpoint, though, this was a really hard shot to get. Shutter speed was almost maximum because they're so quick. So of course you have to compensate in terms of aperture, in terms of ISO. But more importantly, the reason it was so difficult to get is when you get a pod of dolphins, you get a lot of these animals, and it's herd mentality. I now understand from a predator's perspective why it's hard to focus on one animal, because you have all these animals just moving together and you don't know where the focus. And I think it's one of the most difficult things when you get a herd of animals moving very quickly, or a flock of birds, really focusing on one thing. And again, this is where animal behavior comes into play. We noticed that these beautiful dolphins were, bow hopping, which basically means they're going through the waves and just jumping through the waves. Some of them are spiraling in the air like this one. So then it becomes about looking at the dorsal fin right underneath the water and deciding to focus on one individual. So instead of just kind of swinging your camera, because then you get blur effect, it's about focusing on that one individual and figuring it out, when is it going to come out. So this was a hard image to get. Really happy a few guests were able to get it as well.
That's really cool. And going back into our more comfort zone of overcast, I
Yeah.
know this is a particularly cool species, so I'll just hand it right back to you to talk about this one.
Yeah. So this is in the St. Lawrence estuary, for those of you who might not be familiar with that. It's an area in eastern Quebec, in eastern Canada. It's not too far from the border with New York. It's where the St. Lawrence River meets the Atlantic Ocean. Essentially, you get a lot of things happening there. So you get a lot of different species. What you're seeing here is, and this is not for the faint of heart, unfortunately, but you're seeing a gray seal, which is a very, very significant animal. It's pretty massive, and it has actually been able to predate a harbor porpoise, which is the smallest whale on the planet. Harbor porpoise, being anywhere between 6 to 10 feet, give or take. This is while I was doing conservation work in the estuary, working with marine mammals, which of course these are two of. And the reason I wanted to include this is to show how powerful images can be, not from the simple visual aspect, but what they can do down the line. When I was doing that conservation work, we kept finding harbor porpoise skins mangled up on the beaches, and they had these perfectly surgical lines cut through them. And for a very long time, the theory was that they were being poached. Nowadays no one eats harbor porpoise in Canada. Well, pardon me, in those waters anymore. Um, and we just couldn't figure out what was going on. I mean, what could possibly be natural that's making these perfectly triangular cuts? And then one day we're just zooming around, we're patrolling, and from the corner of my eye, I see something just flip up, 10, 15 feet in the air. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And even my co-pilot, we were very confused. So we kind of just hung around for a little bit, and we saw it happen again. We realized this gray seal at high speeds just swung right into this harbor porpoise, popped it up in the air, and then stunned it, and then started, of course, eating it. So we just hung out for a while watching this. Of course, again, it is a very sad thing because harbor porpoises are very cute, but the gray seal needs to eat too. I mean, the circle of life is a thing. But long story short, what we realized after it predated it, we actually found the carcass of the porpoise, and it had those perfectly, triangular cuts in it. And what we realized was that these harbor porpoises weren't being poached; they were being hunted by gray seals. And the gray seals have the surgical precision with their teeth and dentition to actually do this. So that series of images was used to actually kind of mitigate the theory that they were being poached. And instead, we realized it was a natural thing. So we stopped putting energy into that, put it into other things for conservation.
That's awesome. It's such a good story of the power of photography, and I love your message that not everything has to be this like technically perfect photo. Sometimes a descriptive photo is just as powerful.
Yeah,
So I think I know we initially build this as Arctic to Africa, but I wonder if we should hold back from the Africa to open up a little time for questions in the last few minutes.
sounds
Uh,
good.
and then I think we need to schedule a part two so that we can dive into the rest of
So
these photos. So Rob, are there any questions in the chat that we should look to?
Thanks, guys. Yes, we do have some questions, but before we get to them, I would like to remind everyone that if you do have some questions, you can submit them via the question field in your control panel. So let's dive into them because we do have a few. So Anthony, talk to me about presets. Do you ever use them? Do you recommend them? Can you talk about that a little bit?
absolutely, that is a great question, one that I get probably on every photo trip I ever do. What I like to say is everybody has their preferences. There's no golden rule to photography. It's what I love about photography. I use a couple of presets here and there, but not very many. I'm someone who likes to just flicker with things in the moment. I adapt to the moment. Is it more work? Probably. Does it mean that sometimes I miss the shot because I'm twiddling around with my settings? Yeah, honestly. But presets are something that I'd say if you're starting out, that's what I did a lot of the time. I took just the hassle out of twiddling around with all of my settings, because of course every camera is different, every menu is different. Once you really learn how your gear works, then I find it's a lot easier. Presets can be such an amazing way to just save a lot of time. And again, if you have something that's very fast moving, like a dolphin that's breaching and spiraling in the air, having that preset might make it a lot quicker for you to just kind of, have a flick of the thumb. So I'd say by all means, it's a great way when you're starting out. Some people, even veteran wildlife photographers, still use it, and I'm never going to knock it down. It's just that for me, I like to just adapt in the moment.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. So, do you have a macro lens in your box, and do you have any advice for macro shots?
Macro shots. Oh man, that's a whole other world. The widest lens I have is probably my 14 millimeter, which I use for Northern Lights photography. You might have caught a little glimpse of that as Rob was going through the slideshow. I don't play around too much with macro. I actually use my phone a lot for macro photography because the lenses on it are really good. I'd say that if you're going to go into macro, do a lot of research because there's so many amazing lenses that have started coming out. I mean, people are capturing these amazing moments of these tiny little insects on these tiny little leaves with very specialized cameras. I'm not one of those people. I like big game. I also like some smaller things. I like big, wide landscapes. That's what I love about working in the Arctic. So it's not my realm of expertise, but I'd say that if you're going to go down that rabbit hole, have fun with it, explore, because there's so much new stuff coming out.
Do you use a polarized filter, say on polar bears on a bright sunny day?
Ah, I do not. I do not. I am very much of the school of thought that I don't want to put anything that's going to compromise the quality of my glass on my camera lens. Again, a lot of people will argue both ways for that. Personally, I've had a lot of success never using them. Sometimes I kind of wish I had them. I have toyed with them a little bit. I find that the quality of the image, though, for me outweighs the purpose of the polarized filter. And again, once you get to know the settings on your camera well enough, you can compensate very well without needing a polarized filter. But again, no golden rule here. So I'd say try it out, have fun. It's a cheap piece of glass that you're not going to spend too much money on. But just keeping in mind the quality of that glass versus the quality of your lens, for me personally, that quality outweighs the need for a filter.
Do you ever use bursts for your photography? Like, was the jumping dolphin photo one image from a burst?
Yes, I will use bursts. I mean, at the beginning, Charlie and I were mentioning how it's easy to fall into that routine, but sometimes when you have a bird taking flight or you have a dolphin jumping, that burst can definitely get you the shot you need, especially with, for example, birds just coming right off. Everyone wants to get that perfect shot of a puffin that's on the verge of landing or a puffin that's on the verge of leaving. So bursts are really, really, really good. Of course, you can also compensate by having a very, very high shutter speed. So I try not to use them as much as possible, especially with megafauna like bears and wolves and caribou. But with things moving very quickly, yeah, I will go down that rabbit hole. I'll get a burst of 30 images, keeping in mind that depending on the speed of your camera, the speed of your SD card, you might have to wait after that. So I kind of try to mitigate that a little bit. I'll take a burst of 15 shots to let it load onto my SD card, and then take another burst if I need to.
Gotcha. Thanks for the advice. What about teleconverters? Do you use that on, say, your Sony lens?
I don't. I don't. I like to try to keep it simple, which is ironic given the fact that I am a gear junkie. I have not needed it because I love my 2-600 lens. I've been having amazing success with it. Of course, I mean, for someone who has a limited budget, for someone who doesn't want, many different lenses, having a teleconverter can be an absolute win in your arsenal to be able to get those really long range shots. I have a lot of colleagues who do use them, and their shots are impeccable. So I won't knock them down. I'm just very happy with the gear that I have right now, and I don't feel the need to use one.
So, what is your favorite editing software for post?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a sucker for Lightroom. I love Lightroom. There's Lightroom and there's Lightroom Classic. Same difference in my opinion. I just have learned with Lightroom because once you learn a software, it becomes very tedious to have to learn other softwares. Especially now with AI, right? There's so many different programs that use AI. I really try to steer away from that because I want my pictures to be my own. I want my pictures to be as close to the original as possible. There's so much AI on social media nowadays. But when it comes down to it, I love Lightroom. For now, it's amazing. It does what I need it to do. I've gotten to the point where I know where my settings are. I know where my presets. So that's my recommendation. But again, no golden rule.
Great, thank you. So, thank you from a lot of people for sharing about Happy Whale. Um, where you're on the whale do you find identifying features besides the fluke?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can find them in a couple of different places. The dorsal fin is one of the best places because not every single whale will show its fluke. Humpback whales are one of the ones that will, gray whales as well. However, that dorsal fin is usually the thing you see at the top of the water at its surface edge. And that is an identifying feature. Every single species of whale, every individual has a different dorsal fin, as well as, unfortunately, sometimes you'll get specific identifying features from injuries. If there are boat collisions, you'll get propeller marks in the animal. So those are a little bit more unfortunate. And then there's other species like fin whales. They'll have something called a chevron at the front on either side of their bodies. And it is a very, very unique identifying feature for that species in particular. But if you go into Happy Whale, they have really great examples of great shots and different identifying features to look for.
Awesome, great advice. Thank you. So we've got some guests that are curious about how one goes about choosing the platform you're using, whether it's Sony or Canon or Nikon. Can you talk about that process, guys?
The ultimate question, isn't it? Charlie, I'm going to throw it to you. What's your go-to?
Uh, I started on Canon, and now I shoot on Nikon. But I think for me at this point, all the cameras, from my opinion, which doesn't count for a lot, are effectively the same. It's just whatever feels most comfortable in your hands, and the menu navigation is easiest for you. Ultimately, and it's so nice that Odin joined us as well on this chat.
He's becoming webinar famous.
Yeah. I would say too with that is for me, I like Nikon. I think the only thing it does differently is that it shoots really flat, really neutral color balance. And so then in post editing, you can bring it back to life in whatever color you remember from that scene. Obviously, going from raw images, that's less true when you're in JPEG. But I always felt that I was fighting Canon a little bit just because of its color profile tended towards being a little bit rosy, a little bit warm. And so, like, if I was shooting something like fall color, I would spend a lot of time in post editing trying to get it back to neutral or trying to get it back to what I remembered. Um, that's one of the only reasons that I've found that's legitimate for preferring one over another. And like, to be honest, I miss shooting some people portraits with Canon just because I think it gives a really nice glow with the way that the camera perceives color. And Nikon with people can kind of be a little bit flat and you have to bring some of that back in. But I don't know what your experience is, Anthony, how you ended up with Sony.
My first point and shoot was a Sony. So ever since, I've just been a Sony boy, to be honest. I manipulated Nikons and Canons, and I totally agree with what you said, Charlie, about white balance and coloration. I think when it comes down to it, especially when you're starting out, it's so overwhelming, especially nowadays. I mean, so many companies are on par with each other. A piece of advice I was given that I really like to tell people is go out and manipulate a camera, see what feels good in your hand. And Charlie, you mentioned that at the beginning of your answer. You know, sometimes it's just the button placement and where it is. Sony's feel good in my hands. I've adopted to them, and pardon me, I've adapted to them, and I feel like they've adapted to me in a little regard. But you know, I know people who shoot with Canon and who absolutely love them. Of course, Odin also wants to be part of this. So I'd say go out, manipulate the camera, see what feels good in your hand, see what lenses also are good with the different camera bodies. You know, I love that the Sony line of lenses because they can pop onto any of my camera bodies. Sometimes that's not necessarily the case for a Nikon or a Canon. But of course, it comes down to what your budget is. It comes down to what you're trying to shoot with and what story you want to tell with it.
Awesome.
Great. Thank you for those answers, guys. So tell me, what next is up for you guys adventure-wise?
Well, I'm actually catching a flight in 3 hours from now to head back to Iceland for my final NatHab Iceland tour of the season. So that's the immediate future. And then off to polar bears in Churchill.
Awesome. That's a pretty good lineup. I've got Maine coming up. I'll be doing the coastal Maine itinerary towards the end of September for back-to-back trips. So that's a really fun one with fall color. And that'll be the first time that I've guided that trip this season. So that's an exciting one to add on.
Amazing.
So,
Are you going to stop by Bar Harbor?
Sure will.
Well, it sounds like you guys are going to have a lot of fun, so I hope a lot of us get to join you. Unfortunately, that's going to be the last question that we do have time for today, guys. So I'd like to throw it back to you for any closing comments you may have for us.
Well, Anthony, thanks for sharing your photos. And we definitely are due for 2, if not 3 follow-ups to be able to get through your first portfolio that you shared with me, let alone your whole docket of photos. So thanks for taking the time to talk with us about photography today.
Well, Charlie, thank you. Honestly, I love being able to talk about photography. And you know, I'd say my closing remark would be when you're taking a shot, think about the story behind it. Think about what you want to convey as a message with that particular image and see, you know, if there's any way to tie it into conservation. We have a beautiful planet. We want to protect it. And photography is a way to do that. It can be such a powerful, powerful tool. And of course, have fun with it.
I think that's the name of our next webinar, Storytelling Through Photography.
I love it.
Back to you, Rob.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of fun. Thank you for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. So if you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at 800-543-8917, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. And if you're part of a photo club and would like NatHab to speak to your members about nature and travel photography, email us at webinars@nathab.com. Join us Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and the replay will be available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We will see you next time.